Do we switch on what's yours?
Hi, and welcome to the Baumer Conversations. My name is Erik Herrmann. I'm an assistant professor here at the Knowlton School of Architecture. Tonight's speakers are Laura Bauman and Andrew Zago, principals of Bouwman Zago in Los Angeles. The work of Bouwman Zago is celebrated for its prescient articulation of emerging sensibilities. In 2011, Zago Architecture was selected by the Museum of Modern Art in New York for its Foreclosed, Rehousing the American Dream exhibition. And in 2015, Andrew Zago and Laura Bauman were selected to represent the United States at the US Pavilion for the 15th Venice Architecture Biennale. As these projects demonstrate, the practice's posture in architecture is assertive, not reactive. Andrew and Laura's collected designs and writings affirm a keen understanding of cultural histories, ranging from the role of perspective in shaping civic imagination to the contrived relationship between color and form in architecture. Their work is imbued with captivating aesthetic experimentation that intricately links art, architecture, and urbanism to reconfigure conventions and relationships that are often assumed, seldom acknowledged, and still in fewer circumstances challenged. This semester, Bouwman Zago has been the focus of the 2021 Herbert Baumer Memorial Seminar. The Baumer Seminar is a unique pedagogical model here at Knowlton. Students in the seminar participate in sustained and engrossing dialogues with visiting practitioners like Andrew and Laura. Students familiarize themselves with the practice's built work, professional publications, and the disciplinary context in which they operate. Baumer conversations range from broad theoretical conversations positioning the architect's work in the field to intense shop talks, where everything, even a few trade secrets, are put on the table. The seminar was first established in 1998, and as a relative newcomer to the Knowlton School, what I've quickly discovered is that the Baumer Seminar is not about extending the fiction of the architect, but rather, as one of my colleagues offered, about observing artists in full control of their instruments. The students and I have benefited greatly from the generosity and patience of Laura and Andrew over the past semester, and I'm looking very forward to tonight's public talk and the conversation to follow. Our audience at home is always welcome to join the conversation by leaving questions and comments for Andrew and Laura in the chat. I always have more questions for these two, but they've certainly indulged me enough this semester. So Andrew and Laura and our very special guest, Tiziano, welcome to the Baumer Conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erik. We're so happy to be here. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the school for having us for the Baumer, especially to you and to Todd Gannon as well. I know this is a little bit informal, but having two presenters give a lecture is always awkward, and now we have a third as well. So we're going to structure it a little differently, and we may be doing some childcare while we're doing it. So in anticipation of the upcoming publication by OSU on some of our work, we're going to present a slightly more thematic presentation about 3 projects. But first, Andrew is going to give a sort of broader talk about architecture and engagement, show us some diagrams that we've been putting together on disciplinarity. And then I'll dive in a little bit more depth to the 3 projects, that being the Visual and Performing Arts Center at UIC, the federal project for Detroit that we put together for the Venice Biennale, and Property with Properties, that's the project that we put together for MoMA Foreclosed. And with that, I will turn it over to Andrew and let him take you through.
Great. Yeah, well, a couple, great, also everything Laura said, doubly so. This is, I was telling Erik before we started, I think we have about 4.5 hours worth of materials here, loosely organized, and we promise not to go nearly that long. What this is really, this is the Baumer Lecture Pandemic Edition. And, I think if you consider it a little bit of a draft of our lecture and draft of the book that we've been thinking about quite a bit and putting it together, I think we've got a lot of the pieces and a lot of the topics we're juggling all of these things right now. And we'll try to put it together in as kind of a clear way as possible in hopefully what'll just be 45 minutes or so that we can get to the questions and answers. More important than the questions are the answers. I'm going to share my screen now. We will share our screen now. So this is, yeah, Bouwman Zago, Baumer Pandemic Edition. This is on the more serious topics. This is, you know, there's been a lot of, frankly, soul searching in the field of architecture and in our own lives and our own practice and teaching. Certainly since the summer, about what it means to be a responsible architect, one that promotes fairness and equity and strives to see past biases. And I think we've all come to learn that as much as we would like to flatter ourselves and say that these biases are not explicit, we do understand implicit bias. And so we think about this a lot. And you know, frankly, while we're not by any means model citizens on any of these points, this is something that goes back a lot further than the summer for us. We were in Detroit for a number of years. It's hard to avoid issues of radical disparities when you're in that kind of working environment. But the thing we wanted to talk about is two different things about engaged architecture, what that means as a professional. I don't have a lot to say about that, and I think that area is well covered. But the thing that's a little trickier is what it means to be, let's say, a disciplinary, an architect that strives towards disciplinary practice. That itself is a complicated term these days. So we're going to try to go through, and the couple of projects that we're going to highlight, in particular the one we did for Detroit and the one we did for MoMA, tries to look at what happens when you take disciplinary questions and simply project them into a complicated social and political question. And do we have any traction there? And so the question of what architecture as a discipline can offer in those situations is one that we don't know how to answer. But I think one thing that we would maintain is that it's not nothing. What that something is maybe is fiendishly hard to qualify and quantify, but it's not nothing. So the first one is, you know, the profession, and that it's very easy to maybe just say that is all the licensed architects in the world. That can give us a pretty hard outline around it. There's not a lot of vagary. Those that are responsible professionally for shaping the built environment, and let's say there's a professional component of architectural education as well. So those components of it line up the profession. So what do we do? And we are very much think of ourselves as professionals, both in terms of teaching and practice especially. You do those things that you need to do first as a responsible citizen. Then within the profession, you try to make sure that you are offering opportunities for those who have not been traditionally given easy opportunity and access to the field, in terms of people we work with, who we think of as clients. Are we willing to work pro bono for clients that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it? What we do for expanding project types and inclusion in the field. These are all super important things. It doesn't answer this other question, which is the difficult question of disciplinarity. And so I wanted to offer a couple of thoughts about it, and I'll try to go into it as through it as quickly as I can. It's something that I've talked about in other forums in somewhat more detail. And it's a diagram like this, and Todd and I actually used this in an essay that we put together a couple of years ago. The diagram predates that, and it's understanding the discipline as this tiny little subset of the profession. But first, there's that odd word. I mean, we like to use it in its older term, in its older sense, in Latin, which means a field of knowledge, not the kind of medieval Christian idea of punishment or severe limitations, but actually as a field of knowledge. But it just, you know, cultural knowledge in the field seems a little bit of a mouthful. You know, there's lots of bad connotations. It somehow it implies master and disciple, and I wish it didn't have those connotations. So, you know, we'll use that term in this lecture, understanding that its roots are good, but it's fraught. So we have this very small circle that has a dashed line. And, people always wondered what that dashed line means. Well, first off, it goes outside of the profession, as you can see, although it's largely inside the profession. Most of the work that we think of as being about advancing the cultural project of architecture happens through buildings, not exclusively, but mostly. So we thought we'd zoom in on it and take a look. And you just go in there, and this is like you go in with a microscope and you start seeing all of these germs going around, which is all of the different projects that one might possibly consider. And say, now, what is the discipline? Now, there could have been a time where, maybe there was a very clear outline around it, and maybe this was called a canon, and we understand why that's problematic. It's not clear to me that was ever so fixed or ever agreed upon, but certainly it was biased, and things were excluded from it sometimes through in ways we don't like. But I always imagine, and I think now we can actually extend this argument more forcefully, that it's not one thing. I wish Laura and I had this much overlap if we were each to define what we think of as the discipline, or that one might have been us 5 years ago and another one us today, or another group of people would have a completely different idea. And how dare you put F, T, U, and J in that orbit? It doesn't belong there, never mind X and V. So you start, or this could be, let's say, snapshots in time, that as you start going through it, you start seeing a number of different fluid things. And this is all shaped by projects that vie to matter, vie to work off of some kind of shared cultural knowledge. And then we see how it plays out. There's no one master referee to this. And there's no master narrative to this. I would argue, to the extent that there still is and there has been, I think is the problem. But I think this points to the fact that it can continue to change, and that at some point, there are projects perhaps that fall in the middle that many can agree to. There's a bunch that fall outside and we just get rid of them. And we end up with what I'd like to call the stochastic cloud of disciplinary disputes. And so that's a trademark. So then when we come here, this is the difficult part, because disciplinarity tends to be today sometimes seen as either elitist game playing or an exclusionary definition. And Lord knows it's been that plenty of times, but I think to say then we can't have it at all is simply then to plead an entire ignorance of the field. And I think that should not be acceptable to us, that we should like the quavering outline and strive to change its morphology all the time, but not imagine. But because there has always been a difficulty with the cultural, intellectual, and artistic vagaries of architecture as a discipline, you start getting non-disciplinary models. And one of the classic ones is to just find another field. And find another field. It's really good if that other field is recognized as being important, is maybe currently more fashionable than architecture. And then you say, that's actually what we should be about. And so you could just take ecology, sociology, fill in the blank. And then you say, I have ecological architecture, sociological architecture, technological architecture. I saw a thesis at SCI-Arc a few years ago that was Instagram architecture. Why not? Instagram seems to be more fun than architecture. So that's one. And we understand it, but we reject that as a model of disciplinarity. The other one, and this has to do with lots of people we know and love, probably the origin of SCI-Arc, has to do with the anti-field, the architectural iconoclast, the lone genius, architecture sui generis, or even worse, architecture as a personal project. I have it all inside of myself. I don't need to know all of these other projects. That's just, again, a kind of intellectual games playing. Now, in recent years, there's been a retrenching with disciplinarity, and some of these I think are quite problematic as well. The first one, which is popular with young people, I'm going to call happy with history. And for the happy with history, what you do is you don't quite go to a canon, but you don't think of it as being, you think of the history of architecture as being a given, and you find funny ways to flirt with the boundaries of it, usually with a lot of color and funny shapes. And I call that the kind of neo-postmodernism. The second one, which is, one that I think our practice has a lot of sympathy for, also is relatively tight. But this one says that there's a solid, somewhat abstract, but immutable core to architecture, and that we need this reactionary connoisseurship. This is a slightly older, often European crowd that would practice this. I could name names, but we don't have time for that today. And I'm calling this the neo-traditionalists. We think there's another model which has a lot to do with this idea of a dynamic cloud, which is that you extrapolate a novel condition that doesn't currently exist, but let's say stands on the shoulders of other kinds of projects near and far. And by virtue of the strength of the project, you make a kind of disciplinary speculation, and by dint of its convincing nature, you get an after, where suddenly a few letters and symbols get kicked off the island, and the new one finds a place there instead. So what this doesn't make a discipline by exclusion. This makes it by doing something new that makes some previous work irrelevant. And I think that's actually the way that these things go forward. Okay, or as it sometimes, for those of you who know Italian rebuses, the past is a springboard and not a couch. Okay, so I'm going to do this super fast because Laura's going to go on in a minute. How am I doing with time?
You're doing very well.
Says I'm doing well with time, so
which is unusual.
Yeah, that is unusual. So a topical constellation, and as I mentioned, this is a kind of, let's say, a map of provisional terms and projects that we're thinking about for the subsequent book, and let's say a properly structured lecture that would result from this. And it really goes around 3 projects that happened within a relatively short period of one another. There's the Property with Properties, the project that we did for MoMA that Erik mentioned, the new federal project for Detroit, and UIC Visual and Performing Arts Center, the last 2 being done at almost the same time. There's a number of footnote projects that could go with it. And I think this is what I would talk about longer, and I'm going to stop myself from doing it. But this is what I meant by a constellation of projects around these larger planets. I guess planets aren't in constellations, but pardon my mixed metaphor. We would have ones like this, which are urbanism per se, which is a quite old project for Berlin, the Spreebogen, the MoMA, and the project in Detroit. Projects that Laura's going to talk about that deal with the attempt to project disciplinary concerns into the life of events in politics, which is those 2 projects. The next one would be what we refer to sometimes as categorical difference. I remember Jeff Kipnis and I both using the term multiple ontologies for this at a certain point, where one thing is actually made of things that fundamentally don't belong together. Then the one after that is, I don't know, for lack of a better term, a kind of disaggregation, breaking things into a lot of very small parts and letting that be the structure of it. And then sometimes this difference happens through a kind of awkwardness of form, and these are the projects that would exemplify that. The last one with each of these 3 buildings, especially the 2 on the left, the models themselves became a certain kind of presence in the project, almost as a way of difficult to understand the project without understanding the models as well, especially with the mock-up for the Biennale for the last one. And then finally, color, which is, let's say, color as a component of the form and space of a project, as opposed to something that's applied. That happens to a great number of our projects. Very quickly, the first project, all the way back 1986, the disaggregation of the human body and putting it back together into a kind of architectural form. Berlin Spreebogen, trying to find in the reunification of Germany, not one thing, but a complicated set of layers that maintain their autonomy and intermix, another project of disaggregation. In elevation studies, which we just finished, there's 25 or so of these. These were kind of proto-architectural studies, working by cutting and putting together a bunch of boxes, as you can see here. But this was both important in terms of disaggregation and well, color as space. A project we did for Arup, I mostly throw it in here because when I showed that spray bogan project at our last Baumer session, Todd noticed how similar it looked to the installation that we had done for a satellite office for Arup. And then this really follows out from the VPAC project. We were asked to do a very large mock-up of the building skin by Mark and Sharon, and this is a half-scale mock-up of that skin that we did for the biennial. And then just because I'd mentioned this, oh, Vilnius Concert Hall, this was another awkward form project just to show something that wasn't in our previous lecture. And then hot off the press, I had mentioned, and this is when Todd accused us of being ontologists and not phenomenologists. We're interested in color, of course. Now we're actually starting to build things purely with color, just shaping color pigments into various arrangements and making models from them at this point. Although we'd like to actually make entire buildings out of, say, ultramarine blue. I think that would be a good, that's a goal. Just showing you, this is just stuff from this spring. Literally like enough pigment to build a substantial model. Okay. I'm going to now hand it over to Laura.
I think you're gonna run the screen for me.
Okay.
The toddler has fallen asleep on me, so we'll do this as a.
We're going to speak very quietly.
So, as I mentioned, the first of the three projects I'm going to show is the Visual and Performing Arts Center at the University of Illinois Chicago. And just because all of the work that we do has always an amazing team of people that come to our office to help us, our consultants. I include these slides to make sure it's recorded in history. Briefly, this is a program to house 4 performing arts theaters, some art studios, education in classrooms.
No, just go like that.
Okay, we're coordinating.
We're giving cues for how to go forward.
And you can see this is the Circle campus of UIC, just next to downtown Chicago. And that red outline showing the parking lot where this would be sited adjacent to the freeway. So obviously putting some sensitive acoustic programs right there had some problems. Go to the next one. And you can see how it's meant to sort of tie some of the campus that exists on the other side of the freeway to the CATA campus south of the freeway. Now, as Andrew mentioned quickly, talking about disciplinary concerns, in this project, categorical difference and awkwardness of form is critical to it. It's an urban project. It's not necessarily urbanism in the way that some of the other 2 projects will be. But here, as Andrew's flipping through these study models, these are all about 2 inches high, 3 inches high at the most. The models were an essential part of the project, and they're intended to have their own presence, meaning that they're not supposed to be accurate representations of a future building, but they were supposed to help us test this sort of sliding of characteristics across at different scales and different colors and different materials. Color, again, is integral to the form and the space. So I'm going to let him sort of flip through. I don't think there's too many more of them. We must have produced at some point, like 100 study models for this. And we're getting closer and closer to the final sort of configuration. We realize, because of the complexity of the program, that there's a sort of public interface with the theaters, as well as student programs that had to be separate from that. So you'll see a sort of aggregation of, especially in this one, the theaters being stacked into that clear volume on the right side of the screen, and then a sort of stacked grid, thickened grid building of classrooms and studios with a kind of mushy, what is that, brown colored clay, literally just holding them together. Of course, now finally it gets kind of refined here in these axonometric views. The orange piece you're seeing there is an element we call the fifth theater, which is essentially our solution for the problem of circulation up to the theaters and the towers. So it's a circulation space, it's a fat squiggle, it's got a crazy color to it, you can perform in it, you can walk through it, and it's the sort of glue piece that holds those two components together. Here, especially in the section, you can see how that works. On to the next one. And this for us was a really sort of critical representation of the project, this section through that fifth theater where you see the skin of the performance tower behind. If you look closely, you can see there's a sort of remnants of the Chicago biennial wall in there. When we did the wall installation, we went through a sort of second version of this skin. So you'll see across these projects that skin reappears in sort of different ways. And then quickly, I'll just walk through the plans because I think it's important. These are all rendered views looking at that fifth theater from the campus side. A model in progress. Again, now this is one that we put together for the Chicago Biennial. So the project got a sort of second generation. It's not that dark blue color anymore on the theater tower. It's got a sort of finer underpainting coloring to it. And then the model being put together for the presentation. Now, as you walk up through the tower, you get progressively higher and higher to the largest performance space, which is on the top floor and opens up with a big view to downtown Chicago. So in that sense, the project has quite a presence. And here, especially, you can see our aspirations for that view to the skyline of Chicago. And the final plan there. Now, looking back from downtown, you can kind of see the interchange of the freeway there, but this is quite a tall project there. And then that's just a close-up of the skin. And then essentially from the freeway side, our approach to the acoustic problem was to put a sort of service bar building and use that to block a lot of the sound coming from the freeway and stack everything on the other side of that bar building. So it sets up a kind of a nice elevation. That bar becomes a nice sort of plinth piece on the freeway side. And the last one.
Sears Tower, I think.
Is that from Sears Tower?
Willis.
Willis. Oh, sorry, yeah. Okay. How am I doing on time, Erik? Am I? All right. So the next project, which was done sort of concurrently in the office, and these were both big projects for us, and they overlapped by a few months, was for the architectural imagination at the US Pavilion at the 2016 Venice Architecture Biennale, curated by Cynthia Davidson and Monica Ponce-de-Leon. To the next slide. And so we were assigned, there were, I think, altogether 16 teams. Each team, is that right? 12. 12.
Yeah.
12 teams, and each set of 3 teams was assigned a specific site in Detroit. Ours was at near Eastern Market along the DeQuinder Cut, if any of you are familiar with that. And beyond being assigned a site, we were not really assigned a program. And so a big part of our task was to come up with a reasonable, I should say, not reasonable, a plausible program to justify a large architectural project in the city. And so going back to something Andrew mentioned earlier, this would be a case where a disciplinary concern intersects with contemporary life and politics. At this point, John Kerry was still Secretary of State. This is ancient history now, given what's happened in the last 4 years. And at the same time, there was a massive refugee crisis in Syria. And so we thought, and we give a lot of credit to David Bergman, who was a part of our team, who brought up the notion of an exogenous shock, that being something that from outside the system can affect a radical change. And in this case, rather than looking to, let's say, the auto industry rebirth or a couple of sports stadiums to correct a problem in the city, we thought there needed to be a sort of exterior event In this case, we suggested that 68,000 Syrian refugees be resettled over the course of 5 years in the city of Detroit. And that in doing so, you could leverage a significant amount of federal money to build support programs for them, to build housing, understanding that over the course of 5 years, many of these refugees might move on to other cities, but that this would be a significant portion of the population, let's say 10% of Detroit's population at its lowest point, which was, I think, 680,000. And so you could leverage this crisis, right, to actually get some really significant investment in the city, right? You can.
Oh, this is showing the peak of Detroit's population is all the figures there. The little green ones on the bottom was the current population, and that's what a 10%, a kind of tithing of population would be. And this is what it would have meant. The purple was what the amount of refugees that the Obama administration had proposed to admit, and we added, let's add in a few more and bring them all to Detroit.
Right, and so this is showing the kind of timeline of resettlement. So, this was, once we sort of landed upon this idea, we knew we had hit on something good when we saw a sort of New York Times editorial at the same time that was talking about resettling Syrian refugees in Detroit. So we knew there was a kind of like moment right there that we were tapping into. But let me see, what's the next slide there? So this involves going into exactly what kind of population we were bringing, how many children, how many adults, how many households, and what would the housing requirements be for that. And while we didn't design all of the housing, we did a significant amount of analysis of the area adjacent to our site. So this is looking at, I think that's Gratiot Avenue there, what the previous housing stock of the city looked like. And I think the previous slide showed it more. And you can see on the top right of that slide really what it is now. So if we go through and analyze exactly how many single family plots are available in an area that's adjacent to our site, there's a really reasonable way to propose some new housing getting built in the city. So in this diagram, our project, which is comprised of 6 buildings and some other urban effects, is in that lower left of the diagram. And then the orange rectangles are showing all of the housing that could be built adjacent to that.
So would in fact be necessary for that population, and which then remains because the refugee population cycles through and this becomes new housing for Detroit.
So then if you focus in on our site, now we've sort of justified why we would need all of these big new federal buildings. And so we proposed one which is called the Federal Building, which has a kind of library and performance space, educational facilities, etc. 2 small office towers, which are marked A and B here on this diagram. Those would be like live work towers. And you could imagine you'd need a number of support staff to come to the city to help take care of these, to help make the transition over these 5 years. And the flat building, which is F, Andrew's circling it with his arrow. I don't know if you can see that. Which would be a sort of emergency housing and warehouse space. Could have a second life as a museum or an educational facility. And then the food hall down there at the lower left corner, which is over an exit ramp from the freeway that was proposed to be sort of cut off. And so we kind of slow down the whole traffic of that area. We build these, we have these 6 buildings there, and then you can see a kind of topiary piece and a bioswale south of Gratiot there. And so I'm going to show you each of the buildings really quickly. Oh yeah, that's the diagram showing the closing of that freeway ramp and just how much area is given over to not that much traffic. That's looking back. So here's the first building. And again, this is a project that's got categorical difference and awkwardness of form. And really what you see when you look at these 6 buildings is a sort of constellation of differences. And you have leaping across scale and material. You have different sort of leap motifs here, the squiggle, which These are two-dimensional drawings, but they become three-dimensional structure, and they get applied to the glass hall. Here, this is looking up the freeway ramp, and you could imagine this is, a farmer's market, a winter garden, and then this is just a plan through that food hall. And then this is our site model. You'll see coming back all the time, and I keep referring to different buildings here. So in the center there is the flat building. This is a model of, I think, a 1/4-inch scale model of the flat building. It's got an ETF roof, so it's just kind of clear open space with lots of pull-up doors along one side, and a kind of gridded structure. You'll see the grid reappear as another motif in the site plan, for instance. Here in one of the towers, the grid appears, but it's kind of not behaving, let's say. So you get a kind of sloped ramps on one side and rooms on another. This would be like a live work tower, not huge, but I think it's like about 14 floors, right adjacent to the cut. And then paired next to that one is a second tower where the thickened grid really starts to misbehave and start pretending like he's a squiggle. And so here he is in his final form. This was the model that we shipped to Venice. One of the heaviest models we ever made. It's out of solid chipboard. I think it weighed like 50 pounds. And then to the federal, again, to the federal building, which is this one also on the Dequinder cut, you see the skin wrapping around the side. This is just a digital model to help us build the physical model, but you see what was the Fifth Theater in VPAC sort of gets embedded inside the federal building and kind of pokes its way out a little bit. So here it's functioning a little bit the same in that it's a kind of circulation piece inside, but it's not trying to tie two different buildings together. It's its own element there. And then that's a section through the federal building. You can see a theater there and that sort of Fifth Theater piece embedded in there. So here, all of the models are, this is the installation at the Venice Biennale, and you can see we have the squiggle drawings on the wall. We have the plans and sections, but the models themselves really became sort of a critical piece. They're all at different scales. They are just sitting there together on the table, like they all, belong exactly where they are. In the site plan, they're in a very different orientation to each other. They're made out of different materials. There's some similarities in colors that move across, like the site model is a pink that's painted onto the squiggle model, the food hall model, and the sort of severe black and white of the one tower shows up again under the skin of the federal building, and the squiggles appear as a sort of site motif. And then finally, MoMA, which a lot of the Baumer seminar students will be very familiar with because we spent a long time with it last week. And so here I'm gonna fly through it again. Erik, you feel free to stop me at any point here now. So for MoMA, this is now another urbanism project, except it's looking at suburban developments in Rialto, California, in the Inland Empire. And the sort of prompt for the workshop and exhibition was change the dream, change the city, which we turned around to change the city, change the dream. This also, like the others, sort of categorical differences, not so much categorical differences, but difference by disaggregation. And so quickly, you can see Rialto there on the right side of the screen. It's kind of at the end of the line for the regional train connecting it to Los Angeles. That's fine. Some of the sites they offered us as part of the workshop, but we ended up picking another site, which is outlined in red there, which is a sort of failed subdivision. Not failed anymore, it's doing quite well, but during the foreclosure crisis, development basically stopped there. We were able to get our hands on most of the development package that was submitted to the county, and so got a lot of really detailed information for this. You can see there's about 1,200 sites, but this is what it looked like when we found it. It was sort of all graded, all ready to build, and then nobody was building. So we toured the model homes. We looked at this weird sort of boundary of landscaped artificial space up against the ruggedness of the mountains in the distance there. It's in a very ecologically sensitive area right next to a wash that comes out of the San Bernardino Mountains. So you flip through these. And then the technique that we used to work on this suburb and on this project was misregistration, which is typically understood as a printing error whereby fills and lines don't align properly. Here we took it a little bit further than that and applied it to all sorts of different properties. Here, this actually is maybe one of the most informative images for the project, this and the following one, whereby the property lines that separate one house site from the other define also a change in materiality, a change in ownership, a change in inside and outside, wild and not, and public and private. So taking that just quite literally as a printing misregistration, you could produce all sorts of different, just by sliding these colors off of each other. You can see there's some semi-paved surface, some shared surfaces, some inside garden, inside wild, outside wild, etc. As a sort of, I don't know how to talk about this.
This is where we just have a lot of slides, Eric, and it's not clear that they're in the right order. So
this is
fasten your seatbelt.
We had a wonderful economist, again, David Berkman, who helped us work through the sort of ownership of this large subdivision and what might happen if we peel off of it. So the yellow line is what was going to happen. The magenta line is what did happen. And the blue line is what would have happened if we had intervened when all of the money going out during the foreclosure crisis to help was spent on our project. This is, I think I can come back to this in some of the other ones.
Yeah, these are the various things we looked at, right? The finance and land ownership, the ecology, power systems, construction types.
And then the final sort of site plan, this is not actually the final site plan, but this is informative for how it shows the sort of two different misregistrations that you get when you split what was the existing site plan and then peel off some, let's say, ownership boundaries, move them across other physical boundaries, and how that gets manifest. So here, a community development corporation would own and maintain part of the site. There would be some land bank and easements, and then there would still be single family, fee simple ownership. But you could also then manifest this in different materials. I think we can skip that.
Okay. And they had involutions.
There was a lot of work done on the development of the house forms themselves, but I'm going to kind of breeze over that and just talk about how they, how we dealt with misregistration when it came to the houses themselves. So this is our classic Cheez-It misregistration box. That's a carefully scanned Cheez-It box that's reconstructed where the advertising slides off and around the corners. It's commonly referred to in our office as the box problem. It's fairly simple to solve, but when you get into more complicated forms, it becomes very difficult, and you'll see that in the house forms and the misregistration of the final model.
Just figuring out how a misregistration, which is, let's say, a slight displacement of qualities from geometry, turning that from the inside of printing into something three-dimensional was tricky. It wasn't obvious, but it really was then, not only does it come informally, but it really was then what helped break up the kind of monoecology model of a subdivision, ecologically, economically, formally, circulation-wise.
So here's just an early sketch showing what would happen if you say, imagine a sort of ghosted house over every potential house that could exist in that existing site plan, and what happens when you slide those off of each other. And so we get, different housing types, and that'll show up, sorry, in the later slide. You want to talk about this one?
Well,
We'll just show these slides and keep going. These are models of the existing houses and what happens if you build the space between them, if you turn them on their sides. Some studies for the house type. We were sort of concurrently working on the site plan and the house at the same time. This was at the end of the first sort of period of the workshop, what we presented to the curators. Lots and lots of study models, some structural models, some misregistration models, some involution models. And then concurrently, we were working on the two-dimensional representation of the project. So this is showing the sort of involuted housing as with the section and then the patterning that was applied to it. I don't know if these are...
Boy, these are a few dicey slides here.
So
we were importing them from a PDF when our little incident happened.
So looking at a larger block strategy, it was nearly impossible to look at the whole site. So we isolated a small portion of the site to just test this idea out to see what would happen. Now here you can see some of the houses are sort of flipping into the street. So once you pull apart these different ownership lines from the physical space, you can open up things like ecological corridors, nature corridors going through. And we looked at like the plan for the San Diego Zoo to see how zoo plans work. There was already mountain lions sort of inhabiting empty houses out there. So there seemed to be some kind of logic between, dropping an elephant, let's say, into Rosina Ranch. Here's another looking at the site section now, in addition to the misregistration. This is not the final technique. So here we're still sort of sliding them over onto each other, and you'll see in the final site plan, it's a lot more subtle than that. Looking at the circulation, there's a sort of main ring road that goes through the subdivision. It's like a classic kind of a ladder where you go on a big street to a smaller street to a smaller street to a cul-de-sac. So we were also trying to figure out a way to rewire this subdivision. These are just sketches showing how much and how you might pull lines off of each other. You can see we're testing the sort of radius. What was that thing you said about the radius?
Well, that they're not splines,
Yeah.
which Jesse Reiser noted and told us after he saw the show. I love the site plan. It's not spline.
So these are all tests, and now we're looking at that red would be indicating areas where you might have parks or ecological corridors. And now you can really see that we've taken that quite literally, the ghosted house on top of another house, and started to pull them apart and produced a lot of different sort of house typologies. So you still have the single family house, you have duplexes, you have townhouses, and in some cases where a house slides into a wildlife area, you get a structure that looks like a house but is actually a zoo component. I think we showed that one already. I won't talk too much about these, but these are just some of the graphic tests that we were running through to get at a final site plan that we felt comfortable hanging on the wall of MoMA next to a Rothko. Not immediately next to, but looking at that site circulation and ways to sort of circumvent it. So we break apart, I think the next one.
This is the Albert Pope.
Oh yeah, sorry.
The 1 and 2 would be Albert Pope's ladders, and then ours was a kind of third diagram. We consulted with them on it.
He was also a team member at MoMA.
Right? No, on the Venice.
Venice, yeah. So here's the existing auto circulation. I'll go to the next one. We cut some of the streets, we changed some of the streets to pedestrian only, and you get a much more complex, I mean, admittedly slowed down circulation to your house, but changing that main auto road into an ecological pathway.
For animals.
Animals, yeah. Elephants. And you can see these are just early diagrams trying to break that down. We had to go through and really figure out how we were going to build models for the final show. This is close to a final site plan. So in the end, we sort of double the number of houses. I think we get closer to 2,400 than 1,200. Here's a sort of zoom in of the final site plan, and you can see the pink is the sort of existing houses, and the orange slid off of that. Some of the other...
At first, we thought we had to make each one different. And so we were running grasshopper scripts and coming up with 2,400 different homes.
That's an elevation, a grasshopper elevation study for 2,400 different elevations.
But then we figured out that the complexity, in fact, comes from the moving, how they intersect one another. We only needed a handful of types, and then the.
Here's a building, some progress photos of showing the site model. So this is my periodic table of houses. Color studies for the site model. There was a requirement. The only thing that they required really was a site plan, a site model, and an architectural model. The rest was kind of up to us. So for our site model, we chose a 2-color strategy of misregistration where the pink purple slides off onto the green, which turns out to be a very difficult painting technique.
I always thought this looks a little bit like a poorly printed photograph.
That is a 3D print. 3D prints on a foam milled base, all airbrushed. Here are the housing typologies. We can go through.
Almost done. I'm going to do the last stretch, the home stretch. Because I think we have someone waking here. This is just stuff to look at. I think when we put this thing together last week, Erik, we suddenly realized we had thousands of things that were, a lot of it much better than the final stuff that we ended up putting a little bit of a graphic ribbon around it, and we weren't so happy with it. And we realized when we went into the archives, and so from last week to now trying to put this together, we kind of just found too much stuff. So we're just showing a lot of it. As you saw from what we did, there's a lot more besides this. Aviary next to this ecological zone. This is where 2 of them come together. They would make a courtyard, and there was a little script for how to calculate that if they were far enough apart. And so that was a kind of shared space, and each one would have a little involute, a little doohickey that would stick into that space. I think a doohickey is the right term. We won't show this movie, but this has got a lot of OSU cameos in it, including Jeff and Jose and Todd and others. And I think that's it. Thank you.
45 minutes.
Oh, that was 45 minutes.
That was great. Perfect.
Wow. Is that 45 minutes?
46.
46. Hang on, I got to go back there. Well, Laura will rejoin us in a second here. She's off camera.
Okay, great. Thank you for the talk, and it's always I feel very privileged to have seen some of that stuff multiple times because I think it's finally sinking in. Anyway, there's just so many questions to ask, and the work is so rich. And I would remind all our viewers at home that you can chat any questions you have for Andrew or Laura on YouTube, and we'll try to ask those. I can tell you that there's always already a question about color from someone you could maybe guess. So that'll come up shortly, but for now I have some canned questions. And one thing that I want
to... They weren't going to ask questions.
What's that?
Someone told me they weren't going to ask questions until Monday.
Well, the talk was too good. It was too tempting. So one thing I wanted to ask is, I really appreciated in the intro your discussion of the discipline profession construct, and in particular your focus on discipline as a more kind of generous term, and this idea of a kind of a body of knowledge. And I think that a number of the issues that you were speaking to at the beginning are questions that are being asked in places like this, in institutions of education. So I've heard you speak on this a little bit in other contexts, and I just thought for our audience in this case, it would be really great to get a little insight or get a little thinking on the role that education plays within that that relationship.
Well, no, would be happy to try, and let me maybe even before that, just to kind of not feign expertise on something on our part, because I think there's a lot of firms that have spent a lot of time working on projects that were not in the normal range of because of the client, because of the budget, because of lots of things, because of the location. And so we're quite amateur with that. Albeit when we were in Detroit, we did things for, nonprofit organizations, the Greening of Detroit, MOCAD, which was, the kind of first sort of street level contemporary art piece in contemporary art venue in Detroit. So we certainly worked on a lot of things like that, but I mean, worked on some things like that, but not enough. What I thought was more important was to say that we've tried to formulate a model. Is that like a model for engagement? Like we're waiting for the pandemic to be over so that we can, we're not going to go out and engage with very many people at all right now. We just got our second shot and we're not fully vaccinated yet. But I thought it was important that we neither that we question our expertise, deeply question our expertise, but also to have some degree of trust in it. The disciplinary expertise, the expression, I've done this, trust me, throw out the baby with the bathwater. It's a horrible thing. You don't want to do that. I had to go get them. It's in the backyard. I never did that. No, but we don't. But you know what I'm saying? Throwing out the notion that there's a kind of scorched earth policy to everything that architecture has done, as all of our creative utterances as a corrective to exclusionary practices and exclusionary definitions of architecture. So I think it's, I don't know the answer. I'm going through this in discussions at SciArc and a committee, kind of ad hoc committee on pedagogy. School that, even though it has a lot of the, founded on some lone geniuses, it is, creativity is kind of part of its DNA. And how does that, I don't think anyone is envisioning the end of creativity, but what that means for architecture right now is well, I guess, I don't know, this is not a very clear answer to it. I don't think we're necessarily in a position of clarity, but it seems as if you could frame clear questions at least, and that one ought to frame those questions that include notions of disciplinary knowledge and not imagine that can it's either just like, a bromide of good design, that like a Dwell magazine. Well, we're doing something in the city and we're bringing good design. Like, I think we aspire to more than that in our field, nor is it saying that, bringing all of these disciplinary questions is irrelevant to today's burning issues. I always thought when we were working in Detroit, whatever the client was, not to bring what we thought was the most important things in architecture was in fact a condescension. We'll just save that for the fancy museums and wherever. Now we're dealing with a community group. We better not, we better just check all of those things at the door. And I think that's, let's say our attitude about it is longstanding, if not our solutions to it. Maybe that wasn't enough about schools.
No, I think that's good.
And same for schools.
What's that?
And the same for schools.
And the same for schools. Schools should just do that. I mean, I think it's a moment of a lot of reflection, and so I appreciate that response. So another thing that I thought we could bring up or talk about that's been part of the seminar conversation is just your general approach, which becomes clear within the projects that you present. It's a kind of operative assertive mode where there's techniques and strategies that appear within multiple projects. And I think if you could maybe elaborate a little bit more on this this approach. I think in the seminar we talked about the value of a hunch, like something that you can't prove. using that to find new territory. And so I'm thinking here about like how the XYT films later inform misregistration and other exercises. But I'm curious if you could talk about that a little bit.
Well, it's funny, and this is something that Laura could speak to well as well. So I'm trying to think of in a lot of these projects, I think our categorization and analysis of it is something we can only do afterwards.
For sure.
Is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, oh, let's do a project that connects these. Even that whole thing on those Detroit films leading to the MoMA film, that was I don't want to say post-rationalization, but a post-analysis of it on our part.
Definitely.
Is that right? So, that's the degree to which this lecture had, maybe a couple of too many components was based on us trying to use the Baumer, and in particular the book that would come out, as a way to do that to a series of works. We've been working on this. This will be the second, I guess technically the third of the thing that we're calling a polygraph, which is we've waited too long to do a monograph and they seem to be dead anyways. And so we're going to do a variety of different publications that are topically different. And this one was trying, it's funny, I do note that more and more projects seem to find their way into it, but that there would be a closed set of projects, mainly those three, with a few satellites around them, that would constitute its own kind of idea. And then, I think this is something that Jeff has said, that every architect imagines that every project they do is completely different. We certainly do, and I think compared to many, we do have a variety pack. But certainly when you start going, and I realized we were talking about this idea of categorical differences of things, and then for some reason they were people teaching thesis prep at the GSD were showing old thesis projects, and they dug up my old thesis and were showing it, and I realized, oh my God, I've been talking about that since 1986. That's crazy. Before Tiziano was born. Oh, I think you're muted.
I knew I was going to do it.
Happens all the time.
That's why I didn't go into broadcasting. Since you've invoked Tiziano, maybe I can pass on a question here from Jeff Kipnis. So which came first, Tiziano or color as architecture? This is not a trivial question. Your shift from drawing model to pure color reminds of disegno to colorito. So Palladio yet again, or Giulio Romano finally.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Yeah, so Tiziano would be we of course he's named after a colorist, not a disegno. It's funny. I don't know. I says since Jeff's listening, I seem to remember even back in the Stone Age of Oxruno, which led up to a partnership with Jeff as well. We were trying to figure out how to make a model out of pure graphite, like not tennis racket graphite, like pencil lead. Maybe I just make a model out of just graphite, and so I think that, which I think was part of Todd's observation, that we're what's the word again? Not phenomenologist, ontologist. But I think with color, I just find it so interesting. I don't know where that came from. We were looking a little bit. What's interesting, of course, is that each color is actually a different thing. And that's why in really good colors, they're wildly different prices. And if you try to make pastels out of them, they behave in wildly different ways. I mean, so that the fact that there is a substance to it is something we knew a little bit, and I had a little bit of background in painting and printmaking to know it, but it just seemed like that it also, each color has a kind of natural history and cultural history associated with it. It has it just seemed like also it was also a corrective to lots of colorful things happening in architecture, which seems to sort of trivialize it. So I think we're just thinking, what would be the opposite of trivializing it? Like just taking it way too seriously.
That's great. So the opposite. Benjamin Arias has a question here. I believe Ben's a student. I'm fascinated by the uniqueness and visual identity of your work. I'm curious if you have any styles or architects you draw inspiration from, or if you attempt to find novel forms for every project. And the question continues, Tafuri also speaks of a shock factor as the foundation of architecture. Do you see the misregistration as a kind of shock factor to the work?
I don't know in what context Tafuri would mean that, but it sounds great. Yeah. Shock. Yeah, when the MoMA project in particular, if you saw, the model is, and even we can say it's on our work, the animation was on a loop. It was very, very slow shifting axonometric with all the figures in there. And more than one person called it mesmerizing. Of course, is, Mesmer doing a certain kind of, something to do with hypnotism and magnets. I know that. So the that they were, so the idea that they would be kind of just I mean, to a degree, sort of hallucinogenic. I think it was not that far from our ambition for it. That subdivision, you would live there if you actually wanted. One thing we should mention is it wasn't unlike the one that we replaced, which is a subdivision like you could find anywhere. That part of our model was, see, everyone should make a unique subdivision just like this, in the way we did. So this would be the only one like that, even though there may be 2,400 of these kinds of hallucinogenic homes in this complex. The next one over would be, Santa Fe style.
But to the first part of this question, do you look at any other architects?
I don't do it. I look at her.
Yeah, look at each other. We look at a lot more artists than we look at architects, I would say.
Yeah, but we look at a lot. I mean, we have, we show sometimes these mood boards that we put together, so we have a lot of references, but we, yeah, I think there's a deep bench of architects that we look at carefully that we'll never mention in public. I remember when I was a student, Kenneth Frampton lectured. The Barcelona Pavilion was getting reconstructed, and he was having some issues with some of the materials and things. But he had some quote from Mies van der Rohe in conversation. I think he was talking about the National Gallery. And they asked Mies, were you ever influenced by any of the early modern Russians? And he said, no, and especially not Malevich. So I won't make that mistake.
I mean, I can attest from looking at the work, you guys have a deep bench. You look at a lot, I think.
Well, I mean, that diagram, you can't, and this is something Jeff has taught many times, that you can't go very far if you don't know a lot of projects. That makes a limit. And it also helps to know other things in culture. I always feel like we should know more. I mean, Laura knows more about music than I do. I probably, maybe know more about certain areas of art, but these form part of it. There's always, certain architects and their unrequited love for painting. I don't. We're there.
I can also say that you're there. Yeah, no, it's the shock value comment is interesting, because I think that something that I think a lot about with the Rialto project, or the properties, is that the project has an exactitude. I mean, you've commented on that with the absolute precision in which all these things are brought together, but then it produces this hallucinatory effect and suggests kind of the possibility of multiplicity or openness or ambiguity, despite how exact it is. And so I don't know, I read it not as a precise vision, but more as a kind of like a production effect.
Yeah, I would think when we were trying to figure out some of the color screen, we looked at printing technology. And what's the fellow, the printed image, the fellow who's important, he was a longtime dean of art at Yale. And I can't think of his name. Someone type it into the suggestion box. A great exhibition at MoMA just about the history of printing. And there's some accompanying gallery talks where he talks about the desire to have soft grays, and you always have a kind of binary way of making prints. This starts with like hand prints on a cave to inkjet, and so we thought there was something analogous there, that we wanted the atmospheric and spatial effects that we knew color could make from just looking at paintings, but knew that ultimately disegno was our field. Like, it had to actually turn into hard-edged exactitude for it to be an viable architectural tectonic solution. And so we kind of misread and borrowed things from printing, color separations and ways in which tonality is achieved through that, or somewhere in there. Of course, Seurat's paintings entered in as well, which were less mechanical, but nonetheless broken down that way. And so there is absolutely this is the same thing like being interested in the bad printing of misregistration, and that turns out being very requiring a lot of precision to pull off. I think the color thing was the same way. Laura Grease is just over there taking care of her.
That's great. We have
our other pandemic project.
That one's working out well. So Todd Gannis left a comment. Your work models new forms of coherence, things we might not.
Sorry, new forms of
coherence.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, apologies. Things we might not expect would go together turn out to get along surprisingly well. There seems to be an optimistic political message metaphor in this.
Thank you. The idea of different things coming together. Actually, Jeff had an impromptu phone in to my SciArc studio the other week. We were talking about cross-programming, and he corrected me in that it was actually Schumi getting it from Cedric Price, and that OMA is often associated with that, but the terminology would be different. And we were trying to revive that in a very specific way for some projects we were working on. But that it is to combine two different programs in such a way that they would instantiate and make permanent awkwardness, so that it went from a formal project to in addition to being a formal project, it was also a programmatic project. And this notion that comes from, when we were working on awkward is something, piece I wrote 10 years ago, and it's something that's informed our work, and we see it in a lot of other practices as well. And I think there is something about, let's say, propriety and rectitude of architecture and its ability to project those values onto us, whether, persistently, because buildings are big and stick around for a long time. And so the corollary would be that buildings that have a certain kind of wrongness and informality and hilarity would also impart some of those values on us. But we're also looking at it as maybe ways of bringing it into programming. And in his book on titled Awkwardness, was written almost the same time as my essay, the philosopher Adam Kotsko goes through a lot of movies and television, and ends up with his final chapters called Radical Awkwardness. And it's this idea of being in the world that does not ask for assimilation, but simply sees uncomfortableness as being a positive and permanent condition. And I realized that this summer there were lots of discussions that I sat through and was involved in at SciArc. We went through an entire thing, which is incredible. What's the fellow's name? Dr. Bryant Marks from Morehouse College. This two-part training on implicit bias, and he talked about this as well. You're in a situation and it becomes very uncomfortable. I've come to realize that that's perfect. Like, not every uncomfortable situation is good, but every contemporary situation that's constructive, if it's not uncomfortable, it's either not contemporary or it's not constructive to the moment. And so this idea of the new coherences, I think it's not just us. I think it's a kind of, and not just a mode of forming architecture, but a kind of mode of being that architecture can help engender.
Well, I think that was really critical for the federal project too, because showing that there were these differences in these buildings was meant, especially to be a really positive political act when you're talking about a very, the refugees coming and not feeling like they must assimilate, they must be the same. So showing through the architecture that difference was good, productive.
No, not the melting pot.
Right.
That does, that was certainly the generation. My parents who were Italian immigrants were there, and it was kind of the modernist project. That whole Venice project in Detroit was across the street from Lafayette Park, Ludwig Hilbersheimer and Mies van der Rohe. And that idea of modernism was that it was an emancipation once everyone became the modern citizen. And we wanted to do, we love that project, but we wanted to do a counterpoint. As Laura was saying, that was not, it's not placing assimilation above just frank exposure to difference.
Right.
That's great. So I think we have one more question, and I think it's actually a nice way to wrap up on the topic, because you showed us these kind of this last set of images, the spice rack of color you're working on directly. And so Karen Joy asked, color has different physical origins and also has different frequencies and energies. Do you look at the energies you bring to your work while working with color?
I don't know, I'm not sure if I certainly see things. My own introduction to it was from my undergraduate working with the fellow Vince Castanacci, who was a protege of Cy Stillman and also Joseph Albers, and he taught, when he was a student at Yale, and he taught an extremely rigorous color class, which, and those who know it's in no way a color theory. It's the opposite. It's a training. It's a training in a kind of visual acuity, which I will claim to be an expert in, but something I learned early on. Boy, you take it seriously. I was there like a student is at the end of the semester, and they come up and they say, "What color should I make this model?" It's like, oh my God, do you realize what you just asked me? It's like, yeah, just like, can you tell me which color? So there is this should I put it idea that there is this complex, elusive set of interactions that color creates. But then the thing that I guess the counterpoint to that is that, there was up through the early 20th century, you could go to a certain colorist shop and get a tube of mummy brown. Turns out that was made from ground up mummies.
That's bad energy.
Yeah, that's horrible. I can imagine it was horrible energy. And lapis lazuli being, the most precious, literally worth like king's ransom, and now ultramarine blue, it's identical. and it's one of the cheapest colors you can get. So the entire, part of what we're doing, I'm doing a seminar at Zago called Color, which is just making things out of color. And one of the things each student has to just make their own pigment coming out of the pandemic. A lot of them are like grinding up wine bottles. So I don't know what that means. I guess they're adults. So to be continued.
Yeah, I mean, I'm eager to see where that work goes, and we want to thank all three of you, Andrew, Laura, and of course our very special guest, Tatiana, for joining us tonight. I'm looking forward to the remaining sessions we have in the Baumer series, but thank you.
Including an office visit. You'll see the lab. That's
right. We're really looking forward to that soon. So thank you, guys. I'm sure everyone is joining me, hopefully, and some healthy applause. And so thank you very much. To the audience, we have one more Baumer lecture series remaining on the schedule, and I encourage you to join us again at Knowlton.Watch in 2 weeks to see a conversation with Jermaine Barnes and Shaheen Ribari. That'll be moderated by Ashley Bigham. So that's it for this evening's lecture, and thank you for joining.
Thank you. Bye.
Hey guys.